There we go. I want to welcome Micah Sonneveld to the BML CMSI seminar this week, which gives me great pleasure. Professor Sonneveld recently joined UC Davis, although like a year ago, I guess, something like that, in the computer science department. But she's special in many ways, but particularly because she's also an oceanographer. So that's why you're here. But this cross-disciplinary interest is set in a much broader approach. You would have seen, hopefully you read about it on the announcement. Mike has a quest to bring theoretical constructs and inferences together with observations to meet the needs of modern society. So not just a modeler, not just an observer, not just a geeky in the back, but really trying to address the challenges of modern society using both approaches. At UC Davis, she leads the Computational Climate and Ocean Group, but also has affiliations to the University of Washington, Princeton University, and the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. Micah obtained her master's and PhD from the University of Southampton, which is where and I've just forgotten the name, the UK Institute, Institute of Oceanography. It's like the Centre of Oceanography in the UK. That's really a National Oceanography Centre. So that's why that university is important to us oceanographers. And there she combined already physical oceanography and complex system simulation. She followed that with a postdoc at MIT and has had visiting positions at Harvard University and UT Austin. Geez, how long have you been working at this for? Things you've done already. So this is great. The impact of her work spans academia, national and international policy, with an impressive number of invited talks, I should say, in addition to the high-impact publications. And beyond this, classic Davis style, she practices her commitment to raising awareness around climate change through several forms of engagement and outreach. So the long and the short of it is my pleasure to have you as a colleague at UC Davis and also to welcome you to BML. Thanks, Micah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction, John. And my voice is a little bit quiet, so if this mic doesn't project to the back, please just wave your hand and let me know. But yes, thank you for the introduction. It's really nice to be here. And finally, I've been here for a year, and I feel like a lot like the institution where I got my PhD from, so this is great. Thank you for the invitation. And today I noticed that the title seminar that was broadcast had the word circulation missing. So if this is surprise to anyone, I'll be talking about physical oceanography today, but I do some work also in the biological realm. But I thought this story would be nice. So I'll be talking to you about how we can understand North Atlantic circulation using different novel tools. So I'm based at the computer science department also because I really like using tools, for example, from machine learning, which I think a lot of you might be interested in. So I decided to kind of focus my talk around an area of the ocean that I hope a lot of you are familiar with, the North Atlantic, and how we can understand how that circulation might be changing. And my goal is to try and excite you about both the ocean circulation, but also the methodology, which is really transferable. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to achieve some of those. So like I said, I'm going to be talking to you about the physical component of my work, but I also have a little bit of a footprint in the global ocean ecological space, mainly from the modeling side. And in my work, a lot of the time, I really try to think, okay, what's actually useful here? What is a need? How can I fill that? So that's a very kind of engineering computer science way of thinking about things. But the nice thing is that my work has been able to have a very broad impact. So from malaria to business economics, which really is sometimes very unexpected, but the algorithms are really transferable, which is what I'm trying to sort of make you think about. So hopefully you'll be excited. And what's less exciting is slides like this. So we know that some unfortunate things have been happening. The oceans are really, really a big part of what's changing. We're seeing a lot of accumulated in the ocean and sort of ending up in places where we really don't want them. And of course, in terms of actually buffering things, the ocean has taken up over 93% of the heat, and this slide is fairly old right now, so this number has not gone down. So some of my motivation is to try to understand, okay, with these changes, what is actually happening? How can we understand this in a way that's actually useful? And like John mentioned, I've sort of been doing a couple of different things, but one of them is probably writing too many review articles. So a new one just came out. And the thing that really is exciting to me is that we have these epochs of progress in oceanography where we suddenly are able to see the three-dimensional ocean because we can do measurements. I looked at a very old measurement device this morning, and it's really amazing how far we've come. We also suddenly started getting satellite observations, which really just opened up everything. And what I also talked to some of you about this morning is this evolution in machine learning as well, where we sort of come to the point where we can really start bringing these two things together. And that's something that I'm really excited about. And I know that most of you are familiar with the ocean. But this is just a slide showing you the surface circulation from a high-resolution model. So the colors here are temperature, and you're just seeing these traces of the surface circulation. And what I want to draw your attention to is these. Yeah, this is beautiful. This is from the ECHO model. The ECHO is a model that's come from kind of MIT and NASA. Really great work, but also beautiful illustrations. But what you can see here is that there are these big patterns. So for example, in the Southern Ocean, you have this big pattern, and in the North Atlantic, we have this current here, the Gulf Stream, that sort of wiggles its way up and across the basin. And it's this circulation that I want to draw your attention to here. But for me, my motivation effectively was looking at these types of figures and thinking, hey, there's patterns. How can I actually figure out where the different boundaries are? And of course, these are beautiful, so you can stare at them for ages. But of course, that's very complicated. And what we as oceanographers do is try to make things simpler. I mean, that's sort of the basic principle. How can I make a model, conceptual or computational or otherwise, that is simple enough to be able to, or complicated enough to be able to describe the system, but not too complicated. And this is a very, very cartoonish representation of the ocean, where again, up here in the North Atlantic is where you have warm waters coming in the surface, then something happens up here where they're made dense, so heavy, then they sink and then they return. And this is a really important kind of way of closing the loop of the large-scale ocean circulation. But of course, we make it more complicated to some extent, and I have very few equations in this presentation, but one of them that's just useful as a conceptual model is this stream function. So this is showing you effectively where we have the waters in the surface, the warm waters going up, being made dense to sink, and then returning. So I want you to focus on this upper area here, and this is effectively just a sandwich of the ocean. So the left area here is the high latitudes in the north, and this is Antarctica effectively. And here, the colors in the top, these are very similar diagrams. The colors where you see a red color, that means we have a clockwise circulation. So warm water is being brought up on the surface, made dense and then sink. A blue one is a counterclockwise one. So effectively, like, the strength of this redness shows you how vigorous the circulation is. And that's kind of what you need to keep in mind. So just like put a little pin in the redness is important. And of course, when we think about data, a lot of the time here we think about measurements and observations in the field. But one thing that's really exploded in recent years, which I also had some nice conversations with some of you students about, is our ability to model things and to use kind of our equations and kind of have these really beautiful circulation patterns emerge just by sort of throwing raw computational power at this. And the thing that models do effectively is solve the Navier-Stokes equation and the equation of state. And the reason I'm saying this is because they're really messy and complicated, which is why we throw computers at them. But when we then try to understand what the computers are actually telling us, that's actually also really hard. So in terms of kind of it being an arms race of, okay, I have more computational power, so I have more complicated simulations, you kind of also need to know, okay, how do I actually think about these? How do I gain understanding from these really complicated things? That's that new frontier that I think is really exciting. So advanced computing to actually understand what both the observed world, but also what the modeled world is telling us. And I'll be using model data here, so I just want to quickly run you through what that is, although I'm sure most of you are familiar. I know that there's a really wide range in this audience. So this is just a cartoon of a climate model where you have the ocean part here, and we discretize it, meaning that we sort of cut it up into little boxes. We have the atmosphere and land. I mainly care about the ocean. And here, for these little boxes, you can think about that I have everything I need to know about what sets the ocean in motion in that little box from these really complicated equations. But, and that might sound like, okay, hey, I've solved the problem. I know everything. But this just gets really, really complicated and big really, really fast, because in each of these little boxes, just to understand what the currents are doing, let alone the biology or the chemistry, you know, I have 39 different fields, and there are a lot of grid boxes. Actually making sense of this can get really, really hard. Enter machine learning. So I'll be talking to you about two different kinds, so unsupervised and supervised. And for both, we're going to be trying to classify things. So here, for example, you can notice that in the unsupervised case, we have two axes, so this would be temperature. We have lots of data points. And for unsupervised learning, you don't need to know any of the labels. So here are these different colors. The name of the game is drawing this stippled line and saying, okay, we have a blue blob, we have a yellow blob, a red, and a green one. Now, for supervised learning, I need those labels. So I need someone to have gone in somehow and said, these are the colors here, these are the colors here. And you can see that the name of the game here is drawing the stippled decision boundary. So it's very similar, but either I need the labels or I'm just looking at the data structures. About this kind of classical black box problem, supervised learning is effectively something that you can think about as a neural network and other things, where actually looking at how it's actually doing the different things can get really hard or borderline intractable. So if you think about a black box, you're down here effectively most of the time. So just as a quick overview, initially, we're going to be looking at determining how we can identify the drivers of ocean circulation, so effectively like cut the boxes around the different bits. And then we're going to be looking at how we can predict that using very limited data and understand how it's changing. And then I'm hoping I can get to this bit, because it's one I'm really excited about too, about how we can open up and learn from this black box. So just jumping right in, I think it's fair to say that the ocean circulation, of course, is really important, but in terms of understanding the small things that might also be important, I want to kind of invite you to close your eyes and think about being in a room with a giant orchestra, playing something, a piece of music that you know really, really well. I used to play in orchestras. And you know that the role of, I don't know, the third piccolo is really important, but actually picking it out at the right time can be really, really hard. So even just looking at and trying to find like a tiny little thing, even though you know something really, really well, can be really hard. A similar problem in terms of those non-linearities, those tiny things that sometimes can trip you up, kind of understanding their role in the ocean is really one of those key challenges. So how can we tackle the hurdles posed by this overwhelming complexity in all of the data that we have? And the way that I think about this and what I've pioneered is trying to understand this in terms of using machine learning to identify what I refer to as dynamical regimes. And to explain this, I'm going to go way back and talk about the scientific method, effectively, which is to form a hypothesis and then test it. And what we do a lot of the time is just to observe something like the cannonball going up and then going down and say, okay, I have one thing going on when the cannonball is going up and one that's going down. So I have two regimes. Let me now think about this. But of course, that really depends on having enough observations. And it also very often is subjective and ad hoc in the sense that you have to rely on your prior knowledge. And with machine learning, you don't have to do that. Just listen to the data. So in that sense, what I'm going to present is a methodology to think about, okay, how can I find parsimonious components of, in my case, an equation, but you can also think about this in the context of genes, using machine learning to set up those hypotheses for me. And just to illustrate here, which is kind of what I'm going to be coming back to and improving on, if you think about, so this is the high latitude North Atlantic, you have the Labrador Sea over there, and Iceland is over there. And this is from a great paper, but what they did to try to understand the dynamics was just to sort of chop it up using very straight lines and say, these are the dynamics that are going on in the blue region. Trying to improve on that and trying to get the machine learning effectively to tell you where to draw those boundaries so that I can then understand what the equations are saying is what we're trying to do. And Brian Kaiser wrote a beautiful formalism of this, if you're interested, but I'm just kind of going to be skimming over it and saying, I have a closed set form of equations, and I can either use machine learning to set up my hypotheses or do it by ad hoc testing. But the thing you arrive at is effectively the same. It's a hypothesis to test that you can then use to say, okay, yeah, I gained new knowledge, or, you know, I need to go back to the drawing board. So from the the model now, effectively, remember, I had those 39 different fields in each of the different grid boxes, which is a lot. So in the methodologies that I'm presenting here, which is just specific to this physical oceanography problem, what we're doing initially is using an equation transform, which I'm very happy to talk about a lot, talk about later, and move this into what's called the barotropic vorticity framework. And that effectively just means that I've taken those 39 different terms and sorted them into a bunch of different fields that can be thought of as the dominant drivers in a depth integrated sense. So I'm not throwing away any of the depth structure, I'm just kind of compressing it using physics, effectively. And so for each different grid point, so for each point in latitude and longitude here, I effectively have 5 different terms. And this is the advection, so the component of being on a spinning sphere, the bottom pressure torque interacting with the bottom, and then bottom stress, so effectively the wind blowing against the surface, those pesky nonlinearities, and what's called the lateral viscous dissipation. Effectively, what you have here then is for each point in latitude and longitude, I have a 5-dimensional vector, and that's my data. So I move from very high dimension down to 5 dimensions. 75 is the number of depth levels. And I ask, okay, are there patterns? And machine learning is really an ideal way to look at this. And if you do this type of clustering problem, so this is an unsupervised approach, what you wind up with is that there are 6 different dynamical regimes that dominate the ocean. So the different colors here represent different dynamical regimes, and the different equation terms here that are adding or taking away what's called vorticity, or what's setting the ocean in motion, can be nicely partitioned up into what's important where. So you can notice that, for example, in the area here in the North Atlantic, you have this pink area, and that's one where the wind stress curl and the advective component balance almost perfectly. And really interestingly, although I guess this one is also good. Really interestingly, this is a balance that we've known about as oceanographers for a really long time. It's so well known, it has a name. It's called Sverdrup balance. And if you've taken John's physical oceanography class, you might have heard about it. But these things are very well known, and they drop out of your lap or into your lap using these methodologies, which of course is nice because you see something that you're familiar with. And these bars here are the different area average terms. So these colors are just a demonstration of the fact that using this methodology on these really very, very complex fields, we can simplify it a lot. So in this way, we've gone from being able to, and here I'm just focusing on the same region, we've gone from being able to say, okay, how do the terms balance in these little cartoonish boxes, to having a much more kind of fine-scaled and intricate way of looking at, okay, what are the different terms actually doing where? And you can see, while there is some similarity here, it's kind of different. And if you were to try to understand the terms in this work, they use the same equations, you'd take a lot longer to understand what areas are governed by what. And if you think about this in an evolutionary or an ecological sense, you could think about having one gene expression being really common, and then under, say, a climate change scenario, things not adapting or adapting much more readily than you might have thought initially. And meaning that there's some sort of governing balance in there that you might not be seeing because of the way that you're effectively kind of trying to understand what you're looking at using your prior knowledge, and thus potentially not really being guided by the right things. So here, really what we're doing is letting the data structures guide us rather than our prior knowledge, really giving us a bit of an edge, as I'll be showing. So here, just to demonstrate, we're seeing areas that are, and here's one of the fields where, areas that we know and love since, the 40s, but we can also see completely new things. And these are one of my recent papers where you can then completely rethink how big areas of the ocean actually work. But I decided not to talk about the Southern Ocean because I thought the North Atlantic would probably be more familiar to people. And also going back to this, just to demonstrate the different circulation patterns. This is again this red and this stream function, where I just want you to look at the red things, specifically the red blob here, which we'll be returning to as well. So the takeaway of this slide is that the different dynamical regimes denoted by these different colored boxes really are able to very delicately pull apart the circulation, even putting them back into frameworks that we might be more familiar with, but haven't really been examined in that way. So that was a technical slide. Here's another cartoon slide, where we now can think about, okay, these are 2D images, and you might ask me, okay, these are 2D images, we care about the circulation. The circulation is not flat, what are you doing? And the cartoon here is showing you how the different regimes here is, by the way, Iceland is over here, so the colors correspond to each other. How the different dynamical regimes map onto the circulation. I'll be returning to that, but the thing to note is that where you have the stacking of regimes, where the Gulf Stream kind of comes off and peels off of the coast, and we have this blue streak here, that's where waters are being brought across the basin at depth at around 1,000 meters, which is what we nicely saw in the other, the previous slide, that red blob at around 1,000 meters. And then things are being made to sink up in the higher latitudes, which is also nicely represented. And of course, this is a 3D circulation structure, but we're able to see this from looking at these 2D pictures and understanding what the physics are actually telling us. It's also highlighted in the NOAA AI strategy for ways of thinking about using machine learning to make new progress in oceanography. And these methods are freely available online. I'm not really going through the machine learning technical things, but the methodology is called Native Emergent Manifold Interrogation, or NEMI, and freely available online. I also have a number of wonderful students and postdocs working with me on this. So lots of friendly people to talk to that do very different things, but are all very friendly. And another paper on this was also used in New Zealand's marine area legislation. So what I'm trying to hammer home here is that this way of looking at the system in a very objective way can be very, very powerful. And I should also have said to start with, any questions, and please interrupt me if there's something that Andrew you want me to embellish on. Yes? Yeah, so for NEMI in particular, I quite like a hierarchical approach. So initially, I used an agglomerative methodology, but what NEMI does in particular is use kind of a manifold approximation approach. First, kind of strengthen associations between the data so that it's kind of easier to find the structures that you're interested in. There, we've been using a couple of different methods, so it kind of depends on the data. So if you have one where things are very nicely separated, then you're kind of good to go with a lot of different methodologies. But for example, if you have one that's density-based, so you have some areas that are really densely populated and some that are less densely populated, then scan will usually give you. Does that help? Same model. So the clustering approach, no, but the specific partitioning of the data set, validation thereof, is very tightly coupled to what the underlying structure in the data is that you can, what I refer to as manifold methodologies. Happy to talk about this more. Right, any more questions? Yes? Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for asking. So what I mean is that in some areas, like I've very handily put a picture here. So in some areas, for example, here in the middle of the Atlantic where that pink blob was, even though all the different kind of terms are available, so you could have the wind being really important, you could have interacting with the bottom being really important. But what happens to be most important there, and what's then a dominant balance, is the wind, and the fact that you're on a spinning sphere. So what I call the advective component. So even though you have all the 5 different terms available to you in that spot in the ocean, you can kind of ignore most of them. And what that then means is that 2 of them are dominant. So when I say a dominant balance between terms, that just means that I got to throw away some of them. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. And I mean, similarly, if you're thinking about species distributions, you might have it be possible that, the deer are everywhere. I saw a lot of deer today. It was great. But, in some areas, maybe for some reason, maybe it's, I guess just to make the allegory really simple for myself, maybe it's too wet. Maybe the deer only very rarely go into the ocean. I don't know if they swim. But in that sense, if you're looking at this spatially and you're saying, okay, what species are where, theoretically the deer could stand in the water, but they probably don't, likely because there's no grass there. You guys are probably way more experienced at thinking about these things, but that's what I mean when I say a dominant balance. Everything could be there, but actually you can ignore most of those things because they aren't very important. Thank you so much for the question. Right, so let's look at some climate change stuff. But I hope I've been able to convince you that, looking at, balances and using machine learning to do this is a good idea. And one of the reasons, and now we're going to be pulling in some supervised learning as well, is that, you can then really simplify a neural network problem for you. And the reason why we're also doing this, the reason why I was inspired to do this, is because as a physical oceanographer interested in understanding climate change, a lot of the time I just do not have the data I need. Half the data is missing. And that was just very, very frustrating to me. And I'll illustrate why, but the key challenge that I was addressing here, or motivated by, was to understand the full system using only very sparse information. And most of you have probably heard about the IPCC and the assessment reports and whatnot. But just to make sure we're all on the same page, CMIP stands for the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, and effectively you have lots of different modeling centers around the world, all contributing their really complicated global climate models with, the whole shebang: ocean, atmosphere, land, ice, really, really complicated, huge models, which is great. They run the same experiments, and you can really say, okay, with all these different models, are they actually saying the same thing? That's how you get those really nice uncertainty estimates for what is the climate going to look like in 100 years. And it's great. It's a huge and beautiful resource. But the data that they can share is hugely limited because of that. So, for example, here, I'm showing you that, 23 petabytes are shared. That's a lot of data, but it's still incredibly sparse. So, for example, if I want to understand the meridional overturning circulation, this global conveyor belt circulation, and how that changes with climate change, here you can see this one experiment where we've abruptly quadrupled the CO2 in the atmosphere. All of these models, they're just one dot. And if I want to understand, okay, how is this really complicated circulation changing, I can say, yeah, it's probably going down. But I had some fun conversations today about rapid shutdown of the AMOC. And if you were there, you'll know that I have some opinions about this. But actually understanding what's happening and why it's happening isn't necessarily something you can do just looking at one dot. And a lot of the time that's what you have, which is understandable, because sharing a lot of data is hard. But in terms of being an oceanographer and being interested in, hey, okay, yeah, is the AMOC going to shut down in 2030? That just doesn't get me as far as I want. So, grand challenge, have lots of data, normally at the surface. And what I want is the full data to be able to do stuff like say, okay, what are the global dynamical regimes? How do they look like? What is the AMOC doing? But that data is not available. So what we can then do is to say, okay, what data do I have? And using geophysical fluid dynamics intuition, so GFD here, say, okay, what terms could I then reconstruct? And it turns out that, hey, I just gave myself a bunch of labels here with the different dynamical regimes. So it turns out that I can say, okay, I have these surface data, and I can match these up to the different dynamical regimes. And this becomes a very classical neural network problem. So here we have the inputs. This is a neural network where you have the input fields here in red. It gets passed through a bunch of different nodes. And then for each latitude and longitude, we try to predict, okay, which color am I? And that's effectively how we can then say, okay, this is how I can access these climate data and say, okay, in this area, I'm the pink dynamical regime, this Sverdrup balance, or in this area, I'm the blue dynamical regime, this heat transport across the North Atlantic. And this methodology is called tracking global heating with ocean regimes. And I hope I can get to the black box part of this because it's really fun. But if you want to play around, this is also freely available online with some CMIP data also associated with an Amazon Web Service. So everything's freely available online where we initially have this dynamical regime identification, then this neural network, and then being able to take just any old climate model where we have access to the surface fields to predict these labels. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I can take any old ocean model of interest, extract the input data I need, which is normally, if you're interested in SNP, kind of the data that's available online. And then the Thor methodology uses an ensemble. So you actually do this a bunch of different times, which means that you get uncertainty. And then for each of the different points in latitude and longitude, I can then associate it with one dynamical regime, so one color. Oops. And I can also access these explainability methods, which I hope I'll get to. That's that black box component. So here, again, as well, we tested this extensively on other models where we find that Thor is really very good at predicting these dynamical regimes, even just surface data, which I thought was very exciting. And again, I have a couple of different projects using Thor. And Thor is used both in America and France to try and understand and improve. But to the North Atlantic, because I think it's fun. So this is just a cartoon of the circulation. Here you can see the red arrow is warm waters being brought north. And it's very, very complicated. All the arrows are different circulation structures. The blue and the green ones are colder ones. And the point here is just to, again, illustrate that one dot doesn't really get me there. Is that a question? No, okay, so, sorry. Please ask questions. And the AMOC is also really important or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, really important for heat transport to Europe. So if the AMOC changes, the place I grew up, Norway, would look very different and be much, much less friendly. It's also very important for sea level in the US, as well as things like hurricanes. So we're really very motivated to understand this and understand how it's going to be changing and understand it more than just that one number. So in terms of thinking about this in this overturning stream function, again, this red and the intensity of this red is a proxy effectively for the strength of the circulation, how vigorous it is. And in this scenario where we've quadrupled the CO2 in the atmosphere, and here I'm showing you the results from one CMIT model, the GFDL ESM4. They all have very snappy names. It's basically like an acronym salad, but I'll just be using a couple of them. So here you can see that if we have increased the CO2 in the atmosphere and we run the model out to 150 years, the AMOC really decreases. So, so far so good. But what we want to know is why. And there's generally 3 fingerprints for this, where we initially have the Gulf Stream shifting north. And shifting north means that it sort of edges up. So it peels off the coast further north, which actually means that the resultant circulation doesn't reach as far north. So initially you'll have this kind of healthy trumpet shape that then really doesn't go as far north. So those are kind of the 2 things that we're looking at. And here as well, just to illustrate for people that might not be used to seeing the Gulf Stream, initially what we have is the red here being the Gulf Stream sort of hugging the coast. So this is the color here is the depth, blue being deeper. And at some point somewhere, this peels off. And that location is a really interesting thing, because the model goes from, the current goes from being very much so in touch with the bottom, so barotropic, to being much more baroclinic, meaning that it doesn't touch the bottom as much, it doesn't care as much about the bottom. And the really nice thing about these colors, so here you see the dynamical regimes, and this is Florida. What we can say is that, okay, we have these different colors. Here you can sort of be looking this way. And initially, where we have this blue, you have a very barotropic circulation, so it really cares about the bottom. Then BT is barotropic, BC is baroclinic, and as it moves out, in terms of what these dynamical regimes are telling us, it's caring less and less about the bottom until when it hits this transition, it doesn't care about the bottom at all. And that's also where we have this Sverdrup regime route. So just looking at this, we can have this to see where the Gulf Stream then, as it Atlantic drift or the transatlantic current, has this very healthy trumpet shape. if we weaken the AMOC, it doesn't reach as far north at all. So we're going from this effectively to this. So remember that. And now if we run Thor on different climate models, so here we have an American one. I decided to be, maybe a little bit centric. We also have the UK one, the IPSL, it's French. I have some lovely collaborators from there. If we now say, okay, let's whack everything with 4 times CO2, what happens? And figures are somewhat overwhelming. So let's just zoom in here on this transition area. What you can see is that what we have is all of them starting looking out fairly similar to looking really different in the 4 times CO2 scenario. So here, for example, this orange area has completely evaporated or shifted kind of almost inland in most of them, which is really weird. And really, if I was to trust this, I would really hope that most of them would at least be fairly similar. But you can see there's a huge spread. And if we're now looking at this, do we have this trumpet shape? In most of the modern ones, yeah, we do. It looks pretty good. But now if we look at the 4 times CO2 scenario, we're really, again, kind of all over the place. I'm not sure what the UK ESM model is doing, but it's being fairly creative. So, again, that's not necessarily what you want to see. And just from one number, really, it would be really hard to tell the difference between these. Actually being able to say, okay, this is what the dynamics are actually doing can be really, really valuable. And before heading into the last section, which is fairly short, I again want to pause for questions and not sort of call anyone out who accidentally stretching or something. Yes. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the fun thing with models, right, is that we're sort of using the same equations. So why are they different? Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, the answer is that we have to what's called discretize. So we have to chop stuff up. And you can think of that effectively like if you have a camera and you're taking a photo. If you were trying to represent my face with 5 pixels, or I guess 6, you wouldn't get very far. You'd probably see that I'm white. That might be it. If you give me, 4 million, you'd probably be able to count freckles at least. But in these climate models, they have to be very coarse. So they have to be like very pixelated. And that means that somehow they have to make up for the things that they don't see. That's called parameterization. So you have to stick in a parameter for the thing you don't see. And that's really hard. It's one of the exciting areas of research for how can we actually do this. And things like how am I interacting with the bottom? If I have one area rubbing against the other, like how does that actually, like, do they fall over? Do they not? So they're different because the different models have made different decisions about how they tweak their parameters. And the interesting thing is also, sorry, I promise this is a short tangent. The reason why they look all fairly good in the historical setup, so that being sort of now, is that we have data to compare against. So I know what now looks like, but I have no idea what the future looks like. So the fact that we don't have data from the future to train our models against is one of those really big issues. So, to some extent, I mean, I think that one's pretty unlikely. But, picking between these two. So that's why having lots of different experiments and having this diversity of models is something that you can see as a really good thing. But, on the flip side, this costs a lot, having lots of different models. And if you were to, pool all your resources, maybe you could have, those 4,000 pixels per face, where you wouldn't have to parameterize so much, which is actually kind of happening. It's a big debate where the US is currently wading in, so kind of a fun time to be modeling adjacent, as I sort of think of myself. But great question. Sorry about the tangent. So these ones here from CMIP 6 are around 1 or 1/4 for the ocean. 1 degree or 1/4 of a degree. 1/4 of a degree is one of those resolutions that I find a little bit unfortunate. But they, yeah, not very high. Yeah. Another good one. So it varies. So the GFDL ESM stands for Earth System Model. So usually all of them have ESM in there somewhere. But this one has 75. I think this one has 50. But I would say very few have less than 45. Layers. But they'll be more sort of concentrated towards the surface. Might have 10-meter chunks at the surface and then, a couple of 100 meters towards the bottom. Also a great question. All right, I'm going to use the final. Yes? Oh, it's the gridding. So a lot of the time, I don't think you've experienced this yet, but the way that they, because the world unfortunately isn't a square, it's round, you have to make a lot of choices about where to put your grid boxes. And that's actually also really important for a number of devil in the detail reasons. So it's because of the gridding. It's not physical, it's just sort of where they put Greenland and the interpolation in the plotting software I was using wasn't ideal and didn't like it. Oh no, yes, thank you. I thought you meant around Greenland because those are the most obvious ones. Yeah, so there's a probabilistic aspect to this methodology, and that's where I wasn't comfortable with the. Yeah. Great question. Do you have a question as well? I didn't catch the last one. Oh, the differences in the application. So this Thor methodology is an application that's appropriate for ocean data. So the ocean surface fields that you need are kind of set. So I didn't go over this, but they're sea surface height, wind stress curl, and Coriolis, and another one, I forget. But so there you need that data to do train a neural network on any data you have if you have labels for them. So you need to kind of know what the answer is to be able to have the neural network try to predict the answer for you or some approximation thereof. Quite convinced. Happy to talk more about it afterwards. Okay, so we're going to spend a couple of minutes on this just because it's really interesting. Because I think one of my bugbears a lot of the time when we use neural networks that they are effectively black boxes. And sometimes they are the best we have and they're really, really great. I don't mean to say that using a neural network as a black box is bad, full stop. I'm really looking forward to when we're able to add more nuance to this conversation because I think it's really going to be hugely valuable and we're going to be able to learn a lot. But the grand challenge here for me is to deliver robust, reliable, and safe tools. I talk about this in a number of the articles I mentioned. And what I mean with that, and I'll define XAI in a second, and N stands for neural network here. For example, if we want to predict that this is a horse, a lot of the time you think about predicting cats and dogs or, what have you. And if you want to say, okay, the neural network has correctly predicted that this is a horse, but if you then say, okay, what in this image was the neural network actually using? What was it looking at? And here you can see, okay, this is from a method called layer-wise relevance propagation that I'll also define in a second. But what you can see here is that, yeah, it did use some bits of horse, like ideal, but I guess the head was sort of behind, the leg was sort of behind the one. But what you can see really clearly is that it really, really cared about this thing, and that's a copyright sign. So the unfortunate thing which developers here maybe didn't pick up on is that other images of a horse had the copyright sign in them. And that's bad, right? You don't, like, the copyright sign is not the inherent feature of a horse. And what you want the neural network to do is to have, found the essence of horse, to be able to recognize any type of horse. You don't just want the images of horse with copyright, which is obvious, right? But it can be really, really hard. And here's an example. So here you can see if you were to use a machine learning methodology to try and improve weather predictions. Here you can see where there's radar coverage. So these are the green blobs. And what you can notice is that the areas with black here in the bottom, where we have predominantly black populations, don't have as good radar coverage. So if you were to just train a neural network to predict your weather, you would be racially biasing your weather predictions. And of course that's bad. We don't want to do that. And of course the National Weather Service doesn't want to do that. So this is not on purpose. But unless you predict and treat your predictions critically in terms of trying to understand, and there's so many examples of this, this one is not funny, but they can be pretty hilarious. So I just want to try to drive home that being skeptical of your data and also the things you don't realize about your data is really important. And of course, we care about this on lots of different levels. So black box is bad, of course, but for things like racial profiling. But for physics, really what we can do, and also for ecology and other areas of science, is really try to kind of pay for our free lunch, that is machine learning, with domain knowledge and understanding. These types of approaches are really called for at really high level, both in the US, but also in the EU, that are, in terms of lawmaking, miles ahead of the US. So in this sense, I just want to give you a quick whirlwind tour of how we can actually open up this black box and learn, for example, why predictions are made, and also how uncertain they are. And here, for Thor, again, so this is all sort of grounded in Thor in this talk, we're going to use these XAI, so explainable AI relevance scores, and then also from a probabilistic approach. And just very quickly, again here, XAI is explainable AI. Here, exactly like the horse, you can see this heat map of what the neural network was actually looking at. So initially we trained the image network to recognize the cat. And what we can then do is move backwards through the network and say, okay, what were you actually looking at? And in terms of this, I can see a little nose and little ears, and I'll buy that this is the essence of cat. There is no copyright sign, it's ignored the bar in the background. And this is an example of how you can backtrack through different images. But of course, I don't want to say that I'm a dog person, but cats are great. But I care most about physics in terms of my neural network applications. And here, of course, we have different fields. So here, I've just subbed my physics in. So we have our labels. We train our, depths is the one I forgot. We train our neural network to recognize our dynamical regimes. And then semantic here, what we can then do is say, okay, in these fields, what was I actually looking at? And the thing that's really interesting with that is then that I have the equations. I have the physics, which is exciting. Because then I can go in and say, okay, in some areas like the pink one, here, just again, this Sverdrup area, I know that I could throw away some of the terms. And that means that I can go in and say, okay, for depth in this area, did you, neural network, actually throw away that term too? Or did you not? And here, depth, there's actually so this is an area where the ocean really couldn't care less about the bottom. this area is where we have the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, so this is an undersea mountain range. And the neural network here correctly said, I don't care about this mountain range at all. And that's exactly what I want to see. And the wind stress curl is one of the most important ones. And it really cared about the wind stress curl. So in that sense, I can be very happy and say, yeah, you learned this. And then apply it in a climate change scenario where, like I said, we don't have data from the future. In that sense, we can really root ourselves in our understanding of the system here, physics, but there are direct allegories also to ecology. And this also quickly, to highlight Mariana Claire's work, she's a former student of mine, brilliant, now working at the ECMWF to do weather predictions in Europe. And with her, we also tried to move into a little bit more of sophisticated, like what Avery was asking about. And here what we do is trying to figure out, okay, when we make these predictions, how uncertain are they actually in slightly more formal terms? Here you can see that some areas are really, really certain. So this is the blue, for example, where some are much, much less certain. And going in and saying, yeah, okay, in this threshold area where I know something is important, because we have the North Atlantic the North Atlantic drift here, this warm current bringing waters across, that's kind of a really fine thing. But the neural network was able to predict that with really high confidence and very correctly also said that this is the right one, but another one was really. That then is interesting because I can then go in and say, okay, why did this happen? And effectively here you can see this as saying, okay, in these XAI, in this XAI way here we have the wind stress curl, and if it's blue, then it didn't care about it. If it's red, then it cared about it a lot. And we can see that both for the blue and the pink regime, the wind was really important. But if we look at the sea surface height, for example, we can see that that was really important for the pink one, but not so much for this. That then is something that I can use to say, okay, what made this transition happen? If I just look at these fields, they look kind of the same. There's clearly something important. The important thing is the sea surface height here. It turns out it's geostrophic shear for those of you. But these are the types of games that I can go in and again, this is just sort of showcasing the work of one of my students, a NeurIPS paper actually, where we're doing something very similar, but in the Southern Ocean, playing these games of saying, okay, happening through the circulation, what can I actually do with this? So in summary, thank you for bearing with me. What we looked at was say, okay, how can I understand the drivers of ocean circulation using a very objective way? And we found that 6 dynamical regimes dominated the global circulation. Then we went on to track these and identify them with a neural network and saw how the AMOC weakens and kind of weakens differently across different climate models. And finally, we had a little bit of a whirlwind tour through explainable AI, where I'm hoping that I managed to instill both enthusiasm and skepticism in you. If I managed at least 50% of that, I would be very, very happy. So thank you very much.
Questions from the room or from Zoom? I'll try and pay attention to chat. Thank you. Who wants to ask? Oh, I must give you the box while you're thinking about it.
Sorry, I didn't think about that. People on Zoom couldn't hear your questions. I should have repeated them. I'm sorry. Anyone who's on Zoom, I apologize.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Right. So I had a question regarding at least like the discovery model. And a question I had is, given that how you showed that you use the fluid dynamics model, kind of sort of, but I was wondering whether you had found it where the model detected something that can't be explained by the models, for example, like the those biological outcomes that JavaScript.
You're touching upon the hilarious discussion. It's not hilarious, sorry. That was, I should use a different word. There's a really fun discussion going on about, okay, can the biology actually push the physics? You know? So if that were the case, which in these very coarse, clunky climate models where normally, and you know, this is definitely a gross oversimplification, you have the entire ocean ecology system being captured in, I think, 5 terms. Yeah. So in that sense, the assumption that they made when they hard-coded the models is no. But I think that once our resolution increases, that story might change. If I misinterpreted your question, please correct me.
Welcome to ask simple questions. There's a lot of complicated stuff there. You don't have profound thought. Wanted to ask about global circulation, right? Talk and answer. While you're thinking about it, maybe I'll ask a quick one, which is, how do you know that the AI model, or sustainable AI model, is doing well? That it represents fluid dynamics? Just look at it and say, it's the same, or do you basically resort to statistical correlation? So how do you make a judgment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it's sort of a push and pull, right? I could give an entire, several hours long presentation on that question. Definitely don't want right now.
Yeah.
But the sort of the long and the short of it is that you have the different XAI methods that are among themselves also very sort of a kind of a theoretical computer science or math, where, for example, one of the methods that I didn't explicitly show is looking at, okay, what is the neural network actually doing internally? The method could say, okay, what is the data actually doing? If, for example, you play the game with neural network, the data that the neural network has, and you suddenly turn off the wind, probability that increases or decreases my regime prediction. I could then say, okay, well, if I turn off the wind, the Sverdrup regime doesn't change. So in that sense, it's kind of a push and pull of your definitely a very quickly evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great fun.
Yeah, Mike's not only picking you up when you look down. You have to keep looking at your feet or something. Yes.
I'm sorry.
The people in Zoom lose.
I'm sorry. I hope that wasn't happening throughout.
Yeah, don't worry about them. No. Some of my best friends are thinking about it. Some more questions.
Okay, so my question is there like anything you're really hoping you apply to in the future? Talked a lot about how it's, the future, there was a disparity stuff model. Really cool and could be really helpful. Do you have like a dream application that you're working towards, if that makes sense?
Gosh. That's a hard question. That's definitely the hardest one today. I have lots of different projects. So this is one that, like I mentioned, I have some wonderful friends or collaborators, I should say, and friends in France that are model developers. So it's always a joy collaborating with them, trying to understand what the model is. Similarly, I'm affiliated with the NOAA GFCL lab. They're the ones that made that one model. I really love looking at the Southern Ocean. Understanding what the Southern Ocean is doing when and where is something that I also look a lot at heat content variability and neural networks and machine learning. Try to understand, okay, what physics are actually doing, this variability, and can I actually target measurements and try to understand where to measure properly to do different things. That's sort of from a neural network perspective, I guess. I'm also very excited about developing data mining methodologies. So that was this NEMI method, applications to a range of different. That was a long explanation.
No, thank you. Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
I tried to adjust my collar, but no.
So my question from sort of the start of the presentation, when we were talking about the different, and you said there was 39 different happening. I exactly what you meant by 39. Like that?
Yeah, of course. So you can think about, so in each grid cell, if I'm trying to make this chair move and understand how it would be moving, I could move it that way, or that way, or that way, and it might be rubbing against the bottom. It might be have the wind rubbing against the surface. So I would need information about all of those different things to.
Hey, you mentioned 5 things straight away, right?
So I would need information about all of those different things, and there's in that specific model 39 of them because you have different gradients. It gets really complicated, but so effectively for each cell in the ocean, I need those 39 different fields to understand if this chair is going to move that way or that way or that way, and although it just is the circulation, there are so many different things that are part of shaping that circulation. Does that help?
So like out of those 39 fields, like you know that some of them existed, you have to figure out other ones.
You ask great questions here at PML. Yeah, so doing that first step that I just totally skipped over, the whole and now I wave physics magic. That took a year. So it's called closing the momentum budget. So finding and accounting for all the fields and putting them in the right boxes. Yeah, it's really hard. But of course, you kind of, in theory, know that they should be there. But these models, they're beautiful and lovely, and decades of development from incredibly smart people have gone into them. But that also means that you're dealing with a lot of spaghetti from people that are no longer working in the field. So you kind of have to figure out, okay, who thought that parameterization was a good idea, before I was born? So it takes a while. Does that help? Yeah.
Oh, Christian, probably about time to wrap up. Okay. Yeah, who's behind?
Is someone? Here's one. Do you know if there has been any attempt, or hopefully any attempt, to kind of plug in all the models to one of IBM's quantum computers to be able to actually have the processing power to a high-res model?
Yeah, so did you say IBM specifically?
Yeah, because they're the only company that I'm aware so far that actually has one thing.
Well, I guess maybe I can answer that question, but not quite as specifically. There are things called digital twins, where people are, big teams. So Europe is the one that's currently have tried to make a global simulation that's super, super high resolution. And the problem is that with scaling, even if you have a really, really big computer, because of the sort of the brute force computational PDE solving that's needed, equations, I think you'd need wait for the development until I forget the exact number. I think it's 2060. All individual. So yeah, I don't know. That's sort of depressing, but people are are kind of about it in terms of trying to use the architecture that's there as efficiently as possible, but for a climate simulation, you know, you need hundreds of years. And simulations currently have, I mean, it changes all the time, but I don't think it's more than a decade. The pick your poison type of thing.
Cool. Thank you, Micah. Just checking no questions on Zoom. So thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up. Appreciate it.
Thank you for everyone's attention.